You think the problem is your age. It isn't. You think the opportunity has passed. The energy is gone. The world belongs to the young now, and you are somewhere in the slow descent of life. That is the story the restless mind tells itself, quietly, persistently. But that story is not the truth. The real source of pain after 50 is not the body. It is not the years behind you. It is something more subtle and more correctable. It is the gap between how life is and how you believe it should have been. That gap is where the suffering lives. This video is not going to tell you that everything will be fine. It is going to say something harder and more useful than that. It is going to look clearly at what actually creates suffering in this stage of life and what becomes possible when you stop running from it. There are 10 things worth understanding. Each one quietly changes the way you see where you are. 1. Your suffering is not from age. It is from resistance. Slow this down and look at it honestly. You are not suffering because you are 50 or 60. You are suffering because reality no longer matches the image you are carrying inside. Your body changes. Your energy shifts. Your face carries lines that were not there before. Recovery takes longer. The world moves faster. Younger people seem more confident, more relevant. Technology keeps moving without you. But none of these facts are the actual source of the pain. The pain comes from a sentence running quietly in the background of the mind. This should not be happening to me. That sentence is resistance. And resistance does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like denial. Sometimes it looks like bitter humor about getting older. Sometimes it looks like constantly talking about the way things used to be. Underneath all of it is the same thing, a quiet refusal to let life move forward. When you look at younger people succeeding, what arises? When you notice your energy is lower than it once was, what thought appears? When a memory surfaces of a choice you made years ago, what emotion follows? It is not the event that hurts. It is the commentary around it. The commentary says you should have done more. You should be further along. You should feel differently than you do. This constant should create friction, and friction sustained long enough becomes suffering. Aging itself is natural. Resistance to aging is psychological. Imagine standing in a river trying to stop the current with your hands. The river does not slow. You simply exhaust yourself. Time is that river. The more you fight it, the more depleted and contracted you become. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. If aging were not framed as failure by the culture around you, if no one equated beauty with value, relevance with youth, would this hurt as much? Much of what feels biological is actually cultural. You were taught to fear decline. You were taught that your best years are behind you. You absorbed that idea without choosing it. But impermanence does not care about cultural narratives. Everything changes. Youth changes. Strength changes. Speed changes. The issue was never that change happens. The issue is that you expected something different. When you truly accept impermanence, not as a concept, but as a fact, you stop arguing with something shifts. You stop spending energy on mental protest. You stop replaying conversations. You stop comparing yourself to earlier versions of yourself, to peers, to imagined timelines. That energy becomes available again. Acceptance is not passivity. It is not giving up. It is choosing to start from truth instead of from a fantasy that no longer holds. If you accept that your body needs different care now, you train it wisely. If you accept that certain paths are no longer available, you can see the ones that are. If you accept that time is finite, you become more deliberate, not more desperate. Resistance keeps you anchored in yesterday. Acceptance places you here where you actually are, and rebuilding only happens here. Look at your thoughts carefully. When you say I'm too old, that is resistance. When you say it's too late, that is resistance. When you say my best years are over, that is resistance. These are not facts, they are interpretations. Two people can share the same age. One feels defeated, The other feels focused. The difference is not circumstance. One is resisting reality. The other has accepted it and continued moving. The moment you stop asking why is this happening, you can begin asking what is possible from here. That question changes the direction of everything. 2. Your old identity must die. If you want to rebuild after 50, something has to be faced that most people quietly avoid. The person you were cannot carry you into the next chapter. That is painful because identity feels solid. It feels personal, it feels like you. But identity is not a fixed thing, it is constructed. It is a collection of memories, roles, habits, achievements, failures, and stories you have been repeating to yourself and to others for decades. You are not a fixed being. You are a process. Yet after 50, many people cling harder than ever to who they used to be. I was successful. I was strong. I was important. I used to be disciplined. I used to have ambition. Notice the language. Used to. When you constantly measure yourself against the past, you trap yourself inside it. The old identity becomes a kind of prison. You replay former titles, former influence, former versions of your body, your energy, your relevance. But that version is gone, not because life is unfair, because impermanence is real. Ask yourself honestly, are you trying to rebuild your life or are you trying to recreate your past? These are not the same thing. Recreating the past is not possible. Rebuilding is. If you were once financially secure and lost it, the suffering may not actually be about money. It may be about losing the identity of being the capable one. If you were once admired for your appearance, the suffering may not be about wrinkles. It may be about losing the identity of being the one who looked a certain way. If you were once central to everyone around you, children, colleagues, community, and now feel less needed, the suffering may not be about loneliness. It may be about losing the identity of being important. Identity loss feels like death, and in a certain sense it is, but it is not the end. It is the ending of a form that has already changed. Many people over 50 are exhausted not from effort, but from the weight of carrying who they used to be, trying to think like that person, trying to compete like that person. But the energy is different now, and that is not a failure of character. It is the natural movement of life. What would it mean to have no past version to defend, no reputation to protect, no former glory to compare against? Who would you choose to become today, if today were the only starting point available? This is where rebuilding actually begins, not from nostalgia, not from regret, from a kind of openness. When you accept that identity is not fixed, you become flexible, and flexibility is a form of strength. You can learn new skills, you can reshape habits, you can shift the way you see yourself, but not while you are holding onto the sentence, "That's not who I am." That sentence freezes growth. At 25, identity forms quickly. At 50, it feels rigid. But rigidity is not reality. It is just what has been practiced. Let the proud version soften. Let the ashamed version be seen clearly. Let the nostalgic version rest. You are not betraying your past by releasing it. You are simply acknowledging that it has already changed. Think of how a snake moves forward. It does not mourn the skin it leaves behind. It does not try to return to it. It moves. The old identity had its season. Now quietly it needs to be set down, not violently, not with shame, just with awareness. And in that space, something else can begin. 3. Regret is a useless meditation. After 50, regret becomes quiet but constant. It sits with you in the morning. It appears when you see someone younger succeeding. It surfaces at night when everything is still. It feels reasonable. It feels mature, even like you are simply reflecting on life. But look more carefully. Most of the time you are not reflecting. You are replaying. You replay decisions, conversations, risks you didn't take, relationships that ended, chances that slipped past without being noticed. And every replay carries the same quiet message: if only. If only I had started earlier. If only I had been braver. If only I had known then what I know now. But this mental habit does not produce clarity. It produces paralysis. The past exists now only as memory. And memory is not a recording, it is a reconstruction. When you regret, you are attaching yourself to an imagined alternative, a version of life that never actually existed. You imagine that if you had made a different choice, everything would be better now. But how do you know that? How do you know that other path would not have brought its own losses, its own pain, its own disappointments? Regret edits reality. It removes the uncertainty from the road not taken. It makes the path you didn't walk look clear and simple. And in doing so, it makes the path you did walk feel smaller than it is. Regret is attachment disguised as wisdom. It feels like learning, but it is usually just clinging. There is a real difference between learning from the past and living in it. Learning extracts something useful and moves forward. Regret extracts pain and stays where it is. Look closely at your regret. Is it actually about the event? Or is it about shame? I should have been smarter, I should have been stronger. These are not just regrets about actions. They are slow attacks on yourself. And self-punishment does not build anything. It builds hesitation. You begin doubting every new decision. You tell yourself you always get it wrong. That belief does more damage now than any past mistake ever did. The past mistake is finished. The belief keeps repeating. There is a real difference between accountability and regret. Accountability says that had consequences. I understand them. I will choose differently. Regret says I cannot forgive myself. I will keep returning to this. Only one of those leads anywhere. Here is something worth noticing. The years you have lived have given you something real, pattern recognition. You have seen how impulsive decisions create long-term pain. You have seen how discipline creates stability. You have seen how ego damages what matters. That is genuine wisdom. But wisdom only becomes useful when applied to the present. If you only look backward, experience becomes weight. If you look forward with what you've learned, experience becomes guidance. Instead of asking, why did I fail, ask, what did this teach me? Instead of saying, I wasted time, notice that you now understand what time is worth. The shift is subtle, but the difference is significant. You are not your worst decision. You are not your missed opportunity. You are the awareness that can choose differently right now. Every time regret appears, it is a signal not to sink deeper into memory, but to return to this moment. Because rebuilding does not happen in the past. It happens here, in the breath you are taking right now. And that is more powerful than any if only you have ever repeated to yourself. 4. Discipline matters more than motivation. If you are waiting to feel inspired before you begin rebuilding your life, you may wait a very long time. This is one of the harder things to accept, especially if you grew up believing that real change begins with passion, with excitement, with some decisive inner shift. At 20, energy carries you. At 30, ambition carries you. After 50, neither is reliable in the same way. What becomes reliable is something quieter, discipline. Motivation is emotional, discipline is structural. Motivation depends on mood. Discipline depends on decision. When you were younger, bursts of enthusiasm could launch something new. You could push through late hours, take impulsive risks, throw yourself into something without thinking too much about what it would cost you. But the body is different now. The tolerance for chaos is lower, and that is not a weakness. It is an invitation to operate differently. No one sustains a practice through feeling alone. Practice continues because it has become structure, because it is simply what happens at this hour in this way, regardless of the emotional weather. Rebuilding after 50 works the same way. You do not need a dramatic overhaul fired by inspiration. If your health needs attention, that doesn't require a complete transformation driven by motivation. It requires walking today. eating with some intention today, sleeping with some discipline. If your finances need attention, it doesn't require a bold, sudden move. It requires tracking what is happening, making a realistic plan, following it without letting emotion redirect it every few weeks. If your confidence needs rebuilding, it doesn't come from external praise. It comes from showing up for commitments consistently until trust in yourself slowly returns. Most people over 50 sabotage themselves by waiting for certainty. Once I feel ready, I will start. But readiness is usually created through action, not before it. When you rely on motivation, you create cycles of extremes. One day determined, doing too much. The next day tired, doing nothing. Guilt follows. Guilt creates avoidance. Over time, you conclude that you lack willpower, but the problem was never willpower. It was dependence on a feeling. Discipline removes emotion from the equation. Regardless of how I feel, I will do what I decided. That sentence alone begins to rebuild self-respect. After 50, self-respect matters more than external recognition. You do not need applause. You need integrity between what you decide and what you do. Look honestly at your actual habits. Not your intentions, your habits. Do you move your body each day? Do you protect your time? Do you nourish your mind? Or do you drift according to mood? Drifting is comfortable in the short term and destructive over time. Discipline feels uncomfortable at first and becomes stabilizing. One of the real advantages of being over 50 is that you understand consequences clearly now. You have seen how small daily behaviors compound. You have seen how neglect slowly damages what matters. You have seen how careless patterns grow into real problems. That understanding should not create fear. It should create focus. Think of a monastery. The monks do not wake each morning asking whether they feel spiritual. They wake up because it is time to wake up. The structure holds the practice. In the same way, your life needs structure if you want transformation. Choose one area. Commit to small daily actions within it. Protect that commitment the way you would protect something important. Not because anyone is watching, because you said you would. Over time, consistency builds momentum. Momentum builds confidence. Confidence quietly rebuilds identity. You may not feel dramatic change in the first week or the first month. Discipline compounds invisibly. 1 year of steady, unremarkable effort can accomplish more than 5 years of emotional fluctuation. The hard truth is this: after 50, you cannot afford chaos disguised as freedom. You cannot afford procrastination disguised as patience. You cannot afford emotional decision-making disguised as following your instincts. What you need is calm, intentional repetition. Motivation will arrive occasionally. Welcome it when it does, but do not wait for it. Depend on your decision. Depend on your structure. Rebuilding is not about intensity. It is about consistency. It is not about proving something. It is about quietly restoring clarity and stability, one ordinary day at a time. 5. Simplicity is your advantage. After 50, you have something most younger people do not yet have. You have seen what does not matter. You have chased things that did not satisfy you. You have achieved goals that did not bring peace. You have worried about opinions that eventually became irrelevant. You have carried grudges that only exhausted you. This is not failure. This is experience. But experience only becomes wisdom when you simplify around what it taught you. Many people believe rebuilding requires adding more goals, more plans, more information, more hustle. But real transformation often begins not by adding, but by removing. Simplicity is not laziness. It is clarity. Look at your current life honestly. How much of your stress comes from unnecessary complexity, unnecessary commitments, unnecessary possessions, unnecessary arguments, unnecessary obligations you agreed to years ago and never questioned again? When you were younger, complexity felt like growth. It felt like ambition. You could carry more social expectations, juggle more moving pieces, tolerate more noise. But after 50, complexity drains faster. Your nervous system prefers calm. Your body prefers rhythm. Your mind prefers focus. And yet many people continue living as if they are still 30, scattered, overstimulated, reactive. Then they say, I feel tired all the time. Of course. The way of living no longer fits the stage of life. Simplicity is your advantage now because you no longer need to prove yourself. You do not need to attend everything. You do not need to respond to every opinion. You do not need to compete in every room. You can choose steadiness over performance. Start with your environment. Is your physical space cluttered? Filled with objects tied to old identities, old trophies, old reminders of who you used to be. Clutter is not just physical. Every object carries a kind of weight. Clearing space, not obsessively but intentionally, creates mental spaciousness. Now look at your relationships. Are there people you maintain contact with purely out of habit? Conversations that circle the same negativity again and again. You do not need dramatic confrontation, but you do need selectivity. After 50, time feels different. You sense its movement more clearly. That awareness demands something in return. Now look inward. How complicated are your thoughts? Do you overanalyze every interaction? Replay conversations? Imagine worst-case outcomes. The mind creates layers of unnecessary narrative, and then you wonder why you feel exhausted. When you stop feeding those layers, they lose intensity. That is simplicity working from the inside. Rebuilding your life does not require a grand plan stretching 10 years into the future. It requires clarity about today. What matters today? What strengthens me today? What drains me today? Remove what drains you. You may notice something unexpected when you do. When life becomes simpler, anxiety decreases. Anxiety often feeds on excess options, excess comparisons, excess expectations. Simplicity reduces decision fatigue. Your routine becomes clear. Your priorities become clear. That clarity creates a kind of stability. After 50, stability is more valuable than excitement. You are no longer chasing intensity. You are building something that can last. Simplicity also protects your energy. After 50, energy is precious in a way it wasn't before. You feel when it is drained. You feel when it is restored. Simplicity conserves it. Your advantage now is not speed, it is selectivity. You know what wastes time, you know what leads nowhere. You know what creates suffering. Use that knowledge. Simplify calmly. Release what no longer belongs, and in the space that remains, something more solid can grow. 6. Your mind is still trainable. One of the most limiting beliefs you can settle into after 50 sounds completely reasonable. This is just how I am now. It sounds realistic, even mature. But in truth, it is surrender dressed as acceptance. There is a real difference between accepting reality and freezing your potential. Aging exists. Limitations are real. But the idea that the mind is fixed, that what is familiar is also permanent, is a misunderstanding. The mind is conditioned, not permanent. Thoughts arise through habit, environment, repetition, and attention. What you repeat becomes stronger. What you observe without feeding becomes weaker. This does not stop at 30. It does not stop at 50. The brain continues forming patterns as long as you are alive. The problem is not age. The problem is unconscious repetition. If you have been telling yourself for 10 or 20 years that you are resistant to change, emotionally reactive, or not capable of learning new things, those statements have begun to feel like identity. But they are not identity. They are practiced patterns, and patterns can shift. Look at how many of your current limitations are actually habits. Do you avoid learning new skills because you assume you will struggle? Do you avoid emotional conversations because you believe you are just not that type of person? These are learned behaviors, not destiny. After 50, it is easy to mistake familiarity for truth. Something feels natural because it has been repeated for decades. But natural does not mean unchangeable. It means practiced. Consider how you speak to yourself. I'm too old to start over. It's too late for me. Young people have all the advantages. I missed my chance. Every time these phrases run through the mind, they carve themselves a little deeper. Over time, they feel like facts, but they are interpretations. And interpretations can be questioned. When the mind says I can't, it is worth pausing. Is that objectively true, or is that a habit speaking? Often, when you look honestly, it is habit. The brain's ability to form new connections does not disappear after midlife. It may slow somewhat, but it continues. The difference is that after 50, change requires more intention. Younger people often change accidentally. Their environments shift rapidly and they change with them. After 50, you must choose change deliberately, and there is something real in that. Intentional change is more conscious. It is chosen, not just absorbed. Start small. If you believe you are not adaptable, prove yourself wrong in small ways. Learn one new thing. Read something outside your usual range. Practice responding calmly in one situation where you would normally react. Each small experiment weakens the old narrative slightly. There is a realization that gradually becomes available in this kind of practice, that you are not your thoughts. They arise, they pass, they shift. If you were your thoughts, you would be stable and unchanging, but you are not. You are the awareness through which those thoughts move. This is not a small thing. It means that even long-standing beliefs are not fixed parts of you. They are patterns, and patterns can change. The question is not whether your mind can change. It can. The question is whether you are willing to train it daily, patiently, without demanding dramatic results. Your thoughts are not permanent. Your habits are not permanent. Your identity is not permanent. With awareness and repetition, you can reshape the way you think, the way you respond, the way you move through ordinary days, and that is enough to begin. 7. Your final decades can be your strongest. Most people quietly accept a particular story about life: growth in youth, peak in midlife, decline after 50. This narrative is rarely questioned. It is absorbed from the culture around you, from media, from comparison, from the way older people are sometimes treated as though they have already arrived at the end. But it is a narrative, not a law, and if you accept it without examination, you will begin living as if decline is inevitable, even when something else is still entirely possible. After 50, something becomes available that was not fully accessible before: perspective. Perspective does not attract applause. It does not look impressive. But it is stabilizing in a way that speed and enthusiasm never were. You have seen success and you have seen loss. You have felt the pull of attachment and the pain of letting go. You have watched how impulsive decisions ripple forward into long-term consequences. You have lived through enough cycles to begin recognizing them. That recognition is a form of strength. Youth often confuses intensity with power, but intensity burns quickly. What you carry now is depth. Depth allows you to pause before reacting, to listen without defensiveness, to choose long-term peace over short-term validation. These are not signs of decline. They are signs of something that took decades to develop. The tragedy is not aging. The tragedy is aging without awareness, drifting through later decades, repeating the same unconscious patterns, and then wondering why everything feels like a slow diminishment. But if you bring deliberate awareness into this stage of life, something different becomes possible. Consider how much less you need now compared to your younger self. You no longer need constant approval. You no longer need to compete with everyone in the room. The desire to prove yourself has less urgency than it once did. That loss of urgency is not weakness. It is a kind of freedom, freedom from comparison, freedom from the illusions that once drove so much of your energy. Power after 50 is not domination, it is stability. It is the ability to remain calm when others around you are panicking, to remain patient when the impulse is to rush, to make decisions without being driven by insecurity or the need to be seen. This kind of strength cannot be purchased. It cannot be rushed. It develops through time and honest experience. Many people waste their later decades waiting for retirement to feel meaningful, waiting for others to change, waiting for the right conditions. But waiting without intention leads quietly to stagnation. Conscious action, even small action, creates momentum at any age. You have an opportunity now that did not exist before. You can choose what kind of elder you become. Resentful and rigid or calm and grounded, cynical and withdrawn or steady and present. This choice is not determined by age. It is determined by awareness. The world may celebrate youth because youth is visible, but wisdom is quiet. It does not announce itself. When you enter a room calmly, something in the room responds. When you speak with care, people listen differently. When you remain composed under pressure, others begin to orient toward that steadiness. Your final decades can be your strongest because you are no longer building from ignorance. You are building from experience. An experience, when brought consciously into the present, reduces naivety. It reduces impulsiveness. It reduces the need for things to be other than they are. What remains is realism. And realism, paired with intention, allows something sustainable. 8. Detachment is your greatest liberation. If there is one principle that can transform life after 50 more quietly and more completely than any other, it is this: detachment. Not indifference, not emotional coldness, not withdrawal from life. Detachment means you participate fully, but you do not cling. You care, but you do not collapse when things change. You love, but you do not possess. You work, but your identity does not rest entirely on the result. After 50, attachment becomes more visible. You can see more clearly what you are holding on to because there is more history behind you and more uncertainty ahead. You cling to reputation, to how your children turn out, to financial security, to being respected, to being needed. Clinging creates fear. The tighter the grip, the more anxious you become about losing what you are holding. This is why many people become more fearful as they age, not because they are weak, but because they are more attached. Attachment says this must not change. This must go according to my expectations. If I lose this, I lose something essential about myself. But everything changes. Your children form their own lives. Your body shifts. Your social role evolves. Your influence takes different shapes. If your peace depends on these things remaining fixed, you will live in constant low-level tension. Detachment does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop demanding permanence from things that cannot remain permanent. And after 50, you have seen enough to know this is true. Yet part of the mind still resists it. You may say you accept impermanence, but when change actually arrives, anxiety rises anyway. Because understanding impermanence as a concept is different from genuinely surrendering to it. Look carefully at what disturbs you most right now. Fear of becoming irrelevant. Fear of financial instability. Fear of illness, of loneliness, of losing control. Behind each one of those fears is attachment. You are attached to being seen as capable, to being secure, to being central. An attachment magnifies uncertainty. Detachment reduces it. When you detach, you still work toward stability, but your identity does not collapse if conditions shift. You still care about your health, but you do not panic at every change. You still invest in relationships, but you do not try to control how others live. This creates a form of psychological freedom that very little else can provide. Freedom does not come from controlling everything. It comes from needing less control. Many people after 50 try to tighten their grip on life because they feel time narrowing. They try to control outcomes, to control how they are perceived, to control things that were never fully in their control to begin with. But the more they try to control, the more stress they generate. Detachment moves in the opposite direction. I will act wisely. I will be responsible, but I will not attach my inner peace to results. If circumstances shift, you adapt with intelligence instead of resentment. If someone misunderstands you, you clarify once and release the need to convince everyone. If something you built changes shape, you respond with clarity instead of collapse. Detachment also protects energy, and energy is precious now in a way it wasn't before. You feel its limits more honestly. Many of the emotional storms that drain it are self-created through attachment, replaying conversations to get approval, worrying about futures to get certainty, feeling offended to get validation. Detachment simply allows those storms to pass without following them into the weather. Detachment also applies to the past. You may still be carrying an image of how life was supposed to unfold, a career that was meant to go differently, a relationship that was supposed to last, a version of health you assumed would hold. But clinging to those expectations prevents peace. Let them go, not with bitterness, not with resignation, with clarity. Life unfolded as it did. That is what happened. After 50, liberation is not found in acquiring more. It is found in needing less approval, needing less confirmation, needing less permanence from what was never permanent. When you need less, you fear less. When you fear less, you move more freely. Your final decades can be lighter than your earlier years, not because life becomes easier, but because you are no longer gripping it so tightly. And in that loosening, something unexpected happens. You begin to experience ordinary things without the filter of what they should be. Not as a race, not as a competition, not as a desperate attempt to hold something in place. Just as a conscious experience unfolding moment by moment. 9. Purpose after 50 is chosen, not discovered. One of the most destabilizing questions that appears after 50 is this one: what now? When you were younger, life had built-in direction. Education, career, building something, raising children, establishing stability. There were external structures telling you where you were headed, what the next step was, how progress was supposed to look. But after 50, many of those structures loosen. Children become independent. Careers plateau or shift. Social roles change. Energy adjusts. And the question surfaces more quietly but more persistently than it ever did before. What is my purpose? Many people believe purpose is something to be discovered, a hidden clarity waiting somewhere, available to those who search long enough or wait patiently enough. They wait for passion to arrive. They wait for a sign, and while waiting, they drift. But purpose after 50 is not discovered. It is chosen. The idea that purpose must feel grand or dramatic is another illusion. Purpose does not need to impress anyone. It needs to anchor you. Meaning is not a sign from outside. It is cultivated through conscious intention. It grows from choosing a direction and committing to it, not from waiting until the direction announces itself. After 50, your purpose may not look like expansion. It may look like refinement. You may choose to deepen your understanding of something, to strengthen your health, to become a steadier presence for those around you, to repair what was broken, to simplify what is overloaded, to cultivate peace genuinely and deliberately. The key word is choose. Drifting creates emptiness. Choosing creates direction. Many people feel lost after 50 not because opportunity is gone, but because they have quietly surrendered decision-making to habit. They wake, follow routine, consume whatever arrives, call it a day. Routine without intention slowly depletes something that is difficult to name but easy to feel. Ask yourself honestly, if you had 10 meaningful years left, how would you want to use them? Not in fantasy, in reality. Would you want to remain stuck in resentment, distracted, anchored in regret? Or would you want clarity, stability? The feeling that your days are aligned with something that matters to you. Purpose becomes more urgent when time feels finite. After 50, you understand time differently. It no longer feels limitless. That awareness can either create panic or it can create focus. Purpose after 50 is less about achievement and more about alignment. Alignment between your values and your actual behavior. Between what you say matters and how you spend your hours. Between the inner life you want and the outer life you are creating. Old purposes dissolve. The children grow. The career plateaus. The drive toward financial security stabilizes or shifts. Instead of experiencing this as loss, it can be seen differently as space. You are no longer being driven primarily by survival or social pressure. You have room to ask what you actually want, but that freedom can feel uncomfortable. It requires something. You have to decide. Perhaps your purpose now is mastering your own mind. That alone is significant. A calm, disciplined, self-aware mind influences everything around it without effort. Perhaps it is becoming a source of steadiness in your family, not controlling, not interfering, just present and stable. Perhaps it is health, not vanity, but strength enough to live independently and consciously. Perhaps it is quiet contribution, sharing what you have learned, serving without needing recognition. None of these require youth. They require intention. Many people over 50 underestimate the kind of influence that remains available to them. It shifts form. It becomes less loud and more quiet. A calm presence changes a room without speaking much. A balanced mind becomes a kind of reference point. Purpose does not need applause. It needs commitment. Drifting through your later decades without chosen direction leads to a particular kind of inner stagnation. The mind weakens when it lacks something to move toward. But when you choose a direction, even a quiet one, even a simple one, the mind sharpens. You begin waking up with intention instead of just routine. You measure your days against something that matters. If you do not consciously choose your purpose, the culture around you will assign one. It will call you retired, slowing down, past your prime. And if you accept that label without questioning it, you will begin living as though it were true. You are not obligated to shrink. You are not obligated to fade. You are only asked to live consciously. Purpose after 50 may look quiet, it may look steady, but steadiness with intention is its own kind of power. 10. Peace is the real success. After 50, success needs to be redefined, or you will continue measuring yourself against a standard built for a different season. For decades, success may have meant progress, more income, more recognition, more expansion, more responsibility, more motion. The world rewards action, noise, visibility, and for many years you participated in that rhythm. But you are standing somewhere different now. You have seen what ambition costs. You have seen how constant striving creates tension that does not resolve on its own. You have seen how comparison quietly erodes contentment. You have seen how achievement does not automatically produce peace. And still, part of you may be chasing the same definition. If you do not consciously redefine what success means at this stage, you will measure yourself against standards that were built for a different time in your life. That is a quiet recipe for dissatisfaction. Peace is a different metric entirely, not passivity, not withdrawal, not the absence of difficulty. Peace means your inner state is not constantly disturbed by external fluctuation. Your mood is not dictated by other people's behavior. Your sense of yourself does not rise and fall with praise or criticism. Your mind is not endlessly negotiating with regret and anxiety. This kind of peace is not accidental. It is cultivated. And it is far more valuable than applause. Many people reach later life still restless. They have money but no calm, reputation but no stability, stories but no stillness. They built external structures for decades and neglected the internal one. Ask yourself honestly, If your income doubled tomorrow but your anxiety stayed exactly the same, would you feel successful? If people praised you publicly while you still feared aging privately, would you feel strong? If you gained influence but lost your peace, was it worth the trade? At this stage, peace becomes the clearest indicator of genuine growth. Peace does not mean the absence of problems. Health fluctuates, relationships evolve, money shifts. The world remains unpredictable. Peace means your response to those changes becomes steadier. You no longer collapse when something goes wrong. You no longer become inflated when something goes right. You remain balanced. After 50, emotional regulation is more powerful than emotional intensity. That balance is a form of mastery. Look at your ordinary days. How often are you disturbed? How often are you irritated by small things? How often are you mentally rehearsing conversations that already ended? If the mind is constantly agitated, no external achievement can compensate for that. Rebuilding your life after 50 means prioritizing inner stability above outer expansion. This requires a certain kind of courage because the world does not reward peace visibly. There is no trophy for calmness, no applause for quiet self-control, no ceremony for the discipline of not reacting, but the reward is different. You begin sleeping better, reacting less, thinking more clearly, conserving energy, speaking more carefully. Peace simplifies decisions. When you are peaceful, you do not chase what disrupts you. You do not invest in arguments that lead nowhere. You do not scatter your attention across every disturbance. You choose environments that align with stability, and that choice compounds. After 50, energy is more valuable than time. Peace protects that energy. Without it, even small problems feel overwhelming. With it, large problems feel more manageable. This does not mean suppressing emotion. It means observing emotion without being fully ruled by it. When fear arises, you acknowledge it without letting it choose your next action. When sadness arises, you allow it without making it your identity. When frustration arises, you respond instead of react. This emotional maturity is not weakness. It is the particular strength that experience makes possible. Many people spend their early decades trying to change the world. Very few spend their later decades genuinely changing themselves. But the second is far more meaningful and far more rare. If you cultivate peace deliberately, your later years become lighter. Not easier necessarily. Lighter. You stop competing. You stop proving. You start simply living with intention. You choose conversations carefully, commitments carefully, reactions carefully. That intentional living creates a kind of dignity, and dignity does not depend on youth. It depends on composure. You are not rebuilding your life after 50 to reclaim what was. You are rebuilding to become more conscious, less driven by speed, less invested in impressing, less on autopilot. The years ahead may be fewer than the years behind. That is not tragedy, that is clarity. And clarity is its own kind of gift. You still have breath, you still have awareness. You still have the ability to choose your response to what arises. You still have the capacity to simplify, to release what no longer serves, to act deliberately. That is enough. Strength after 50 does not look like youth. It looks like composure. It looks like depth. It looks like someone who has walked through storms and no longer panics at clouds. And that kind of strength, quiet as it is rare. In seeing, only seeing. In hearing, only hearing. In this moment, only this.